Thank you, John. Thank you for reminding us that the future is to be invented and not inherited. Thank you for reminding us that creativity and leadership is one of the defining characteristics. And thank you also for that analysis of the creative ecologies and also the experience of Steve Jobs and Walt Disney. And they seem to me to be very relevant. What John has done is to actually frame part of the discussion that's going to take place for the rest of the day. But we're now going to move on to our second speaker, Professor Geoffrey Crossick, Vice-Chancellor of the University of London. Again, a very distinguished and experienced colleague in the area of creative economies. Not only is he Vice-Chancellor of the University of London, having moved from being the Warden of Goldsmiths at the University of London, he has been Chief Executive of the Arts and Humanities Research Board. But perhaps more importantly, in 2006, he gave a very influential lecture to the Royal Society of Arts that entered the mainstream of the debate in the UK about the creative economy. His lecture on Knowledge Transfer Without Widgets, the challenge of the creative economy, a slightly odd title, actually moved the government to look again at the whole issue of what it means to operate in a creative economy. His recent essay on The Future is More Than Just Tomorrow, Higher Education, the Economy and the Longer Term, equally has done a similar thing, forcing interesting discussions about the future of higher education. I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Geoffrey Crossick, who will follow up. Geoffrey.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you, John, for that enormously stimulating introduction. I think many of the things that you said, particularly towards the end about learning, education and training, are themes that will be picked up in my presentation this morning. On your final point about universities needing to think more about how they connect, I suspect, actually, I mean, you're absolutely right in many of your comments. I think the universities are thinking about just those issues at the moment, and one of the things that comes out of the report that I'm going to talk about this morning is the ways in which change is happening in universities in the way in which they relate to the creative economy and much more than that. What I'm doing this morning is reporting on giving a presentation about a report that I chaired, a report that I wave in front of you, but I don't have 200 copies with me. I only have one, but I'll give you the website. Actually, it is completely sold out. That may be because it was free. But actually, it's the first Universities UK publication that has completely been used up very rapidly. I think it has made something of an impact. It is, of course, available on the website, and I'll give you the web address at the end. It's a report that I chaired for Universities UK on higher education and the creative economy. I know that in Hong Kong, the creative industries and education have been identified separately as two of the key 6 economic pillars as part of the roadmap for Hong Kong's future, as set down a couple of years ago. And I hope, therefore, that this presentation of the UK experience is particularly relevant to current debates in Hong Kong, not least because the whole issue of the connection and synergies between higher education and the creative economy is not something that's simple, it's not been uncomplicated, and it's not a simplistic success story in the UK. It's been a challenge in the UK. And I hope that as Hong Kong tries to bring together education and creative economy as part of its future development, that there will be something to learn from the UK experience. The UK context is one that Peter Upton referred to in his opening remarks, so I can be brief on this. The UK is and has been a global leader in the creative industry. It's not the only global leader, but a significant global leader. It produces, the creative economy accounts for about 7% of gross domestic product in the UK, compared with 2.6% for the European Union as a whole. And a few months ago, I had a meeting with Androula Vassiliou, who is the European Union Commissioner for Education, Culture, Multilingualism and Youth. They have fairly big portfolios in EU commissions. And we talked about the creative economy. She wanted to talk to me about that. And the question was raised as to why the UK figure is so much higher than that for the EU as a whole, and higher than any other EU country. And one reason that I think is important, is not by any means the only reason, and there are probably some more important ones, but one point that I made to Commissioner Vassiliou is that in the UK, creative disciplines, those disciplines that feed into the creative economy, are located within the university sector, sometimes in universities, sometimes within specialist institutions that are part of the university sector. And that's very important. It's important for cross-disciplinary links, it's important for research, it's important for the ways in which students learn, and also it's important for the value attached to the subjects. And the subjects that feed centrally into the creative economy are ones which in the UK are a valued and central part of the higher education system in a way which they're not in most other parts, many other parts of the European Union. But of course, creative skills and outputs operate right across the economy. There are 800,000 people in creative occupations in other sectors than the creative economy. That is often used by those who deride the creative economy for saying that, or deride the creative disciplines for saying, you see, they can't get jobs as media specialists, as artists, as performers, as creative software developers. They have to work in other sectors. That misses the entire point, which is that in a truly creative economy, people with those skills are used right across the economy. And to repeat a figure that Peter gave you before, 55% of all creative products are bought not by consumers, but by other productive sectors. In other words, creativity is not in a box of its own. The creative economy is not in a box of its own. Creative disciplines are not in a box of its own. They feed right into the whole of the economy. But global competition in these areas is fierce and is growing. And that's one of the things that the UK is experiencing now, is the threat of serious foreign competition, sometimes involving significant government incentives, fiscal incentives for creative economy areas in Canada, in France, in other parts of the world, and of course new media cities and clusters in the Middle East and the Far East. And yet this is an area, in spite of the competition, in which the UK has to succeed. It's one of the areas in which the UK economy has to succeed, because the future of the UK does not lie in cheap labour, because it doesn't have cheap labour. And it doesn't lie in cheap natural resources, because it doesn't have cheap natural resources. It lies in the knowledge, the imagination, the ideas of its population. And higher education is critical to that, particularly a higher education culture in the UK, which gives the UK a real competitive advantage. That is a culture that seeks to thrive on and generate students, graduates, who challenge, who have imagination, and who question the authority of knowledge. That is a fundamental characteristic of the educational system and the higher education system in the UK. It's one which successive governments have tried to undermine by concentrating too much on narrow skills development. I think it's something we have fundamentally to protect. The report that I waved in the air just now, Creating Prosperity, why was it produced? It was produced because Universities UK felt that it was needed. Universities UK is the organisation that represents all universities in the United Kingdom. And it became concerned, partly in conversations with me, but also with many other people prominent in higher education that links to the creative economy, that they were concerned that the role of higher education in the creative economy was little recognised by government. If one looks at major government reports on the creative economy in recent years, the 2008 report on Creative Britain, which I think was a particularly unsatisfactory report, the 2009 report on Digital Britain, a much better report, but actually neither of them recognised the significant importance of higher education. And for Digital Britain, research and higher education essentially came down to technology as being essential for a digital economy. But even more broadly, there was an absence, until recently, from the government's rhetoric in the UK of the importance of the creative economy. That's changed. the creative industries are now regularly referred to by government ministers in speeches, but they mostly do so in the context of something they think of as the digital economy, a term that will, in 10 years' time, we will wonder why on earth we spoke about this strange thing called a digital economy, when digital is simply a technology of distribution and of access. Why do we think an economy is based on that? The focus of government concern for the creative economy tends to be on technology, without enough recognition of the creative as opposed to the technological dimensions of the creative economy. So, Universities UK decided to launch a major report to establish some of the relationship between higher education and the creative economy. It was a one-year project that I chaired. It produced a report of about 70 pages, which has, as I said, been widely very well received. We used some important consultants, very effective consultants based in Scotland, ECOS, to lead on the work. We drew in a lot of partner organisations into the work, arts in higher education organisations, sector skills councils, which are industry-based councils for the development of higher skills, and research councils. And interestingly, it was three research councils were represented on the steering group, not just, as many might have expected, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, but also the Economic and Social Research Council and the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. All three saw the creative economy as something that was very relevant to their disciplines. The report undertook a literature review, case studies, regional focus groups, stakeholder interviews. This was not a quick and easy piece of work, it was a substantial piece of work. What astonished us with the case studies, we wrote to universities asking them for examples of the way in which their institutions connected to the creative economy, because we wanted to have case studies as a fundamental part of the report, real illustrations of what was going on, and indeed some of those case studies are represented here at the conference. We were astonished that we received responses from 65 higher education institutions offering 142 case studies. We thought it would be hard to find case studies. The difficulty was narrowing those down to the 21 who were actually used in the report itself. The report was launched last December in a challenging fiscal climate for higher education and the arts. It was a period in which there were significant cuts to the funding of the arts and of many arts organisations. That really matters for the creative economy, because a creative economy needs a vibrant, wider arts and cultural scene if it's to succeed. We cannot see it as separate. We cannot see there being a business-focused creative economy and then a rather fanciful, fluffy arts sector on the other side. They feed into each other. Creative ideas, creative people, and a creative environment need a wider art scene, a wider cultural scene on which they can thrive. And higher education, of course, is fundamental to that wider cultural scene as well. The project had a dual focus. We wanted to focus on two things. The first is research and innovation, often the neglected dimension of discussion about the creative economy, and John quite rightly raised questions about how well that research is articulated and how well it focuses on the needs of creative businesses. But the whole debate on the creative economy in the UK has tended to focus on talent and skills and neglect the research side. In fact, we wanted to look at the breadth and impact of research on the creative sector, particularly that research which was developed in collaboration with creative businesses, as much of it is. But secondly, the report was going to focus on graduate skills, because creative talent doesn't just appear naturally from creative people. As John himself has very accurately said, everybody who is a true human being is in the early part of their life creative. But that doesn't mean that they can become high quality, effective artists, dancers, animators, filmmakers. All of that needs educating, needs enhancing, needs disciplining within an educational structure, and higher education is crucial to that. 67% of all those employed in the creative industries in the UK are graduates. This is a graduate environment, compared with 31% of employees across the whole of the UK economy. And 80% are graduates in some sectors, for example, animation, interactive media, 65% of people in design, and so on. Creative enterprises are often small, they're micro, they're networked, and that's very important. That's the way in which a whole part of the creative economy, not all of it, some of it is very large scale, but the vast mass of activity in the creative economy goes on in small micro businesses, amongst freelancers and small enterprises. And that's, I think, one reason why governments have found it very hard to focus on this, find it very hard to know what to do. They can handle aerospace, they can handle biotechnology, they can handle pharmaceuticals because they can understand who to talk to there and what is needed. They find it much harder in a complex networked economy. But in that networked economy, education is critical for employability and entrepreneurship. So too is maintaining skills through continuing professional development. That's what the report was going to focus on, and it established 5 key areas of impact. The first is driving innovation through new ideas and practice. The second, supporting regional hubs for innovation. The third is a primary source of talent for the creative economy. Fourthly, universities supporting employability and enterprise. And finally, providing continuing professional development for the creative industries. What I'm now going to do is to summarize the main findings on each of these and also just point towards some of the most significant case studies that are used. So the first is driving innovation through new ideas and practice, something which John Howkins turned to at the end in questioning the relationship between research in higher education and the creative economy. I think some of the points he made, I would certainly, they resonate with me. But actually what I'd like to do is to broaden the perspective somewhat, and that's what this report does. Because driving innovation through new ideas and practice, I think, is essentially about research in higher education institutions. But that research for the creative industries goes on in a number of different areas. There is, of course, the research that feeds into creative content. There's also the research that drives technological change, technology, and there's research that helps drive new business models. None of these go on exclusively in universities. Much of that innovative activity goes on in the creative economy itself. But research in universities is, I would argue, fundamental to all of those. And that includes practice-based research, something in which the UK is very much, has been a pioneer. The notion that when you are researching in design, in dance, in musical performance, in filmmaking, when you are researching those areas, you can be researching purely theoretically, but also you can be researching through practice. And if your practice is challenging existing practice and engaging with existing practice and trying to change it, then you are researching through practice. And the outcome of that need not be a publication. A new ballet, a new computer game, a design for a particular use, all of those can be research outputs because they come out of a research process. And the UK has been very important, I think, in pioneering practice-based research and valuing it within universities and within the evaluation of research. This research is often working closely with small and large businesses and third sector cultural and creative organizations. This goes on in a complex ecological system. As John quite rightly said, we must think of this not in terms of something being produced in university and transferred out. And in the lecture that I gave that Peter Upton referred to, knowledge transfer without widgets, the challenge of the creative economy, this was about how knowledge actually gets developed and transferred, because that is the term conventionally used, when you have no patent on a widget to sell to somebody in return for royalties. There is no widget to transfer. Indeed, in the creative disciplines and in the creative world, when an idea, a new idea, has been constructed, it has often already been transferred because it's been constructed by an engagement between people in the academic world, people in the business world, people in the cultural sector. It's in that engagement, that engagement between people, that new knowledge is created rather than something being invented in a university and transferred out. This means that working across disciplines is absolutely crucial. Across art forms, across the arts, humanities and social sciences, and across to science and technology. It's very mistaken to divide disciplines to emphasize technology alone in the creative economy. Technology provides the potential, but content is what gives it value. And in this, there's been a good deal of mention of Steve Jobs. I'm with Steve Jobs on this rather than with Bill Gates. Bill Gates argued strongly it's science and technology that is needed. Steve Jobs argued insistently that without creative content and ideas, the technology was of little value. And so in the report, lots of disciplines are covered. Yes, the creative and performing arts, obviously, but nanotechnology, computing, literature, maths, psychology are all there because all those disciplines and many more are needed for innovation in the creative economy. And a case study that was presented is of the Horizon Digital Economy Hub at the University of Nottingham, which is trying to establish how you can obtain value from the footprints left when people use mobile internet and other digital technologies. And they are embracing in this research corporates, arts bodies, and other disciplines. The second conclusion is about supporting regional hubs for innovation. We established through the report that regional hubs and clusters were not only critical to the creative economy, we know that. Within a networked economy, micro-enterprises linking to each other and to larger enterprises in a very networked economy, often based in clusters within a region or within a city or within a part of a city. That universities and academics are often important intermediaries and players within those regional hubs and clusters. There was integrated activity for research and knowledge exchange with university staff, students, and businesses moving across the creative sector between higher education and business, because the distinction is often blurred. Staff and indeed students are often themselves practitioners in the creative economy. They spend part of their time teaching, researching, or in students' case, learning, but they're also practitioners outside. It's hard to make a division between whether they're in academia or in the world outside, and that is a critical element in the interaction. Case studies for that, for this regional hubs, University of Abertay in Dundee's multidisciplinary hub for the games industry educates students for innovation in games and digital media. Indeed, if I can dwell for a moment on the issue of computer games, there's a lot of broadly based interdisciplinary work supporting the computer games industry in many UK universities, involving creative and performing arts, computing, humanities, psychology, and other disciplines, working regionally in networks of game developers. I was fascinated on a visit a few years ago to the University of Abertay's Games Centre to discover they had just employed a literary theorist. And I asked what on earth was the use of a literary theorist in a computer games industry facing centre. And he said because the technology is straightforward, it's developing. The future, one of the things we need to do is to deconstruct and reconstruct narrative, because computer games have to become much more interesting and challenging than they are now. That means deconstructing narrative. A literary theorist is a specialist in that. I was impressed. The third outcome of the project was, as one would expect, to underline the importance of producing talent for the creative economy from higher education. It's the contribution that's most often seen, but it's not well understood, and the report tries to unpack it. Nearly 400,000 students and over 5,000 courses related to the creative economy. Not all for careers in the creative industries, as I've said before. They go into business, the public, and the third sector. The education that's provided, and I do think very much that education has changed over recent years, particularly in these areas, is not about teaching the students. It is about creating an environment in which they can learn, to develop their own creative talents, but also learn the theoretical approaches in the history and the current practice of their disciplines. Because without that broader understanding, they will have only short-term abilities. Education them for challenge, so they actually know to ask questions, to think in new ways, and educating them for business. And I agree that is an area where universities have the most progress to make. Each of those is essential. Each of those is essential because education in these disciplines is about much more than the skills needed today. Our students need to be future-proofed. We are educating students for jobs that haven't yet been invented, in the creative economy. We need them to be educated, to be challenging, thoughtful, analytical, so that they can adapt to the challenges of the future, rather than simply training them with the skills needed today and tomorrow. Case study of the universities providing talent for the creative economy is the Skillset Media and Screen Academies. Skillset is an industry-led council for media, film, and animation. They've established, recognized 22 university-based academies, bringing together always industry and academic partners to deliver relevant, high-quality education for the media, film, and animation industries. The fourth area that was established within the report as being important was a focus on employability and enterprise. In just the ways that John was emphasizing, without an understanding of what is needed in employment, but also what is needed in enterprise, in being entrepreneurial, without that, a successful creative career is very hard to secure. In particular, in fields with a very distinctive mode of getting a living. Many people in the creative economy have portfolio careers. They're in employment some of the time, they're freelancers, they have a micro-enterprise, all articulated through networks that ever reconstruct each other for different projects, for different activities. And when I was at a meeting recently with Mark Thompson, the Director General of the BBC, and I pointed to the BBC as an example of, an unusual example of a very major, large-scale corporation, corporate business within the creative economy. He said, yes, but we have 20,000 micro-enterprises who work to us and for us. Even the big ones depend very much on the small. So that distinctive mode of getting a living and learning how to manage that is something that higher education is beginning to engage with. It's the challenge of entrepreneurship, not so much of business skills. Entrepreneurs as a major figure in the creative economy, Patrick McKenna of Ingenious Media, repeatedly told me as we talked about the development in this area, he doesn't want his creative people who work, whose work he finances and supports, he doesn't want them to get bogged down with law or accounting. He said they can hire lawyers and accountants. What he needs them to have is entrepreneurial skills, because that's a version of creativity. It's an ability to understand risk and to understand innovation and new ideas. Case studies for this kind of connection we can see at the Royal College of Art, where Fuel RCA actually helps current students and recent graduates through alumni coming in and working with them to help develop their understanding and their skills. And the Glasgow School of Art has a similar programme, work-based learning for students across all disciplines, often spending time out in creative enterprises, or having people from creative enterprises coming in and working with them. The fifth and final area that the report established as important connection between the higher economy and the higher education and the creative economy is providing continuing professional development, CPD, for the creative industries. CPD in rapidly changing industries is obviously crucial. Students emerging, graduates emerging today with a set of skills and abilities will need those constantly developing. They develop in the workplace, but they also develop them by doing continuing professional development in universities. Universities are often the source of the latest ideas, out of an interaction with creative projects and businesses rather than in isolation within the university. And those ideas are often transferred by the amphibious practitioners I referred to before, the people who spend some of their time teaching in university, other time in enterprises and practice of their own outside it. That's often how the transfer takes place, and often the transfer best takes place by graduates and postgraduates emerging with new ideas and new ways of thinking. Case studies for that which we have in the report are the University of the Creative Arts and Bournemouth University, which John sang the praises of, quite rightly, because in some of these precise areas, a university that is not generally of high ranking, actually is a very high ranking in this kind of area. And they provide master's level CPD courses for media professionals, working with industry partners that include the BBC and The Guardian. That's a very rapid summary of the 5 main conclusions of the report on the ways in which higher education contributes to and engages with the creative economy. But what issues, broader issues, emerge from that? Let me just highlight a few of them. One is that continued investment is needed for high quality provision. The creative economy disciplines are not cheap. They are not cheap in the way in which the humanities and the social sciences are relatively cheap. They need studios, they need the equivalent of laboratories, they need performance spaces, they need design workshops, and so on. And the funding streams for that are under threat in the UK at the moment. That's a worry. Secondly, a better understanding is needed of what constitutes knowledge transfer for these industries. I put down knowledge transfer knowing that it's absolutely the wrong term to use, but it's the language that is used by government. Even worse, government in the UK now talks about it as being technology transfer, which makes it even more limited. Here we come down to the point that I have made a number of times already, which is that knowledge in creative economy mostly is generated as the co-production of knowledge through creative engagements. It's through people working together inside universities, but most commonly between people in universities and people outside universities, working together in the co-production of knowledge. It doesn't fit the technology transfer model beloved of UK governments because it's not a linear process. And actually, when I make speeches about this and talk about this issue of the way in which knowledge is produced by engagement, by personal discussion, by co-production of knowledge, when I make these kind of speeches in an environment where there are people from science-based industries, the industry people say to me, it's the same for us. We don't want to see an invention that is then available for us because it isn't the thing we want. What we like best is getting in early with people in university, researchers, working with them to develop the idea together and to sort out the IP issues later. We need to build a better understanding of the language of skills. Expectations of industry and academia are often different here, and here I'd come back to the question of education for the long term as opposed to skills for tomorrow. Of course, graduates need to come out with skills they can use now, but if we focus only on that, they will have no ability to adapt to the very different skills they'll need in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, throughout their career. Real issues about progress, about employability are there, and here business articulating its demand and universities listening to it still remains something of a barrier. Similarly with CPD, where creative businesses are often small and they lack the resources to engage with universities. Universities need to be more imaginative in the way in which they do that. And a final issue that emerged I want to highlight is we're in the early days of entrepreneurial education, as I referred to it before. We need to understand better how it can be provided, how it can be embedded in creative disciplines and disciplines related to the creative economy in university education. For reasons of time, I won't tell you much about the recommendations, but we did make recommendations to government, to universities, and to creative businesses. When my presentation is put up on the web, you'll be able to see those recommendations summarized for yourself or follow them through to the report. I want to just allow a couple of minutes for some final reflections, which may be relevant to Hong Kong as it thinks about the development of its own creative economy. I hope that much of what I've said so far can be seen as having some relevance to your thinking in Hong Kong. These final reflections may have some further relevance. Only you, who know the Hong Kong scene immeasurably better than I do, will be able to judge that. 5 points. The first is that creative economy is a non-linear world. It's non-linear in its very basis, and this is much of what John was saying in his opening keynote. In the way skills are used, in the way innovation happens, in the way in which policy leads to outcomes. You can't just transfer existing models that were devised for other areas of the economy and assume it will work in the creative economy. It's a non-linear world, a world of ambiguity and confusion, and that's what makes it successful. Governments and policymakers often find it very hard to see a world in which confusion exists without trying to create order. Order can be dangerous in this area. Secondly, a thriving cultural sector is vital to the creative economy. So, the development of the West Kowloon Cultural Hub is clearly one of the many initiatives, and the biggest of them, that is so important for a creative economy to develop in Hong Kong. But, and this is a very big but, a thriving cultural sector alone will not produce a creative economy. There have to be real connections made, and that creativity, that thriving cultural sector, has not just to be large scale, it has to be lots of very small scale, innovative, artistic activity. Thirdly, creative economy will only flourish where imagination flourishes. Societies that value the arts as much as they value business and science is essential. You need an educational culture that values imagination and challenge. And I've been really interested in my last few days of discussions here in Hong Kong to learn about how these issues are being seriously addressed with the educational reforms, secondary and at higher education level, and the curriculum reforms that are being introduced in Hong Kong to address just those issues. Fourthly, creative ideas and graduates will engage across the whole economy. They'll produce value way beyond the creative economy itself. That's something that everybody involved in policy making and in business needs to remember. And finally, the urban setting is critical, something that John and I did not know what each other were going to say, but that I'm ending with the urban setting in ways in which he, towards the end, drew on the urban setting. The urban setting is critical. Space, networks, clusters, energy, this is what goes on in cities and in parts of cities, and you can't produce it artificially. You cannot create a creative cluster in a particular part of the city. They pop up in places you hadn't expected, often in old parts of the city, run-down parts of the city, which people occupy in order to carry on their artistic and creative activities, and where business is set up. And there's a dynamic environment of, in the UK setting, coffee shops, artistic centres, a buzz in an area that cannot be created artificially. But that's absolutely fundamental to local urban creative economies. And I must say that having read the 2007 report on Hong Kong, a creative metropolis, I was really interested there in what I thought was some very thoughtful discussion on urban space, cultural energy, and something that was helpfully described as institutional thickness. I thought that was really interesting. And a very final reflection. Hong Kong's economic pillars, as I reminded myself and you at the outset, include education and the creative industries. The Creating Prosperity report that I've introduced to you briefly this morning shows how they tie closely together. At all levels of education, up to universities, through skills, through education, through research, through knowledge creation. Yet, it is very often hard to get those synergies to work and to work successfully. It isn't easy and it isn't always successful. I'm sure I don't need that much water for the last minute, but I'll leave it for my successor. It's often hard to get these synergies to work. At times, they seem to work in spite of the obstacles that exist, not because of them, not because the obstacles don't exist. The creative economy makes us think afresh about much of this, and many of the lessons inform the wider economy. We shouldn't imagine that policy made for the creative economy affects only that. But a creative economy won't thrive in an unhelpful policy environment. Even if the real growth takes place aside from policy, an unhelpful policy environment can be very damaging. Or you can find in the UK that a creative economy flourishes in the absence of any real policy and then weakens when it needs policy interventions and it isn't getting them. For those who want to follow up the report, there is a very long web link, but I tried to find one that was shorter. There isn't one that's shorter, but if you go to the UUK website and publications, you will find it. Thank you for your attention, and thank you.